What is blockchain? What are the characteristics that make it so disruptive? What are some examples of entrepreneurial opportunities that may lie in the blockchain area? These are the questions that I explore in this episode, where I interview Jordan Woods and Radhika Iyengar Emmons about the exciting area of blockchain. I'm Chuck Easley, Associate Professor at Stanford in the Management Science and Engineering Department. I hope you enjoy this episode. And Jordan, why don't we kick things off by having you guys talk a little bit about your backgrounds and how you got interested and into the blockchain area.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Chuck. So my name's Jordan Woods, and really happy to be here. I originally trained to be a physicist, so I went to Caltech, and my original plan was to be very technical, and so I have a pretty technical background. I moved into becoming an entrepreneur, and I've been a serial entrepreneur, so I've basically been an entrepreneur all my life. I've worked with a lot of different types of companies, everything from applications to infrastructure, again, pretty technical. And so I've been doing that for the last 20 years. I've raised significant capital from Silicon Valley, about 48 million. And then after raising the money, I expanded my company both nationally as well as internationally. I have a lot of global experience. I've worked around the world. And after selling my company and doing a few more companies, I started working with many other companies and governments and accelerators, and have helped many companies raise in total over $100 million. So very involved with the entrepreneurial ecosystem, both nationally and internationally. I got into blockchain about a year and a half ago because it reminded me of .com, which is where I originally was an entrepreneur, and I see this as a massive disruption opportunity, and so happy to speak about that.
Great. Glad to have you here. Radhika?
Thanks, Chuck. Also really excited to be here with you today. So I'm also a serial entrepreneur. Some of these parallel points are going to be similar to Jordan's. Also serial entrepreneur, and have probably had that entrepreneurial DNA spirit all my life. I was educated not in technology. I came out of liberal arts at Bryn Mawr, did an MBA, but started out in technology in semiconductors. Went on to get a certified network engineering background, and was very much involved with networks at the time. To put things into perspective, it was the shift from analog to digital, so it was a while back, but it does give you a view into basic protocols. By way of experience, I've been mostly on the marketing and business development side of things. Also very global by background, originally from India, raised in Morocco, and university educated here in the US. And in terms of experience with the global ecosystem, about 5 years ago, my dream was really to build bridges across ecosystems. And Chuck, I know you've got a particular affinity for that as well.
That's right.
But those of us that are in that cross-border space have a particular global mindset and a one-world perspective on sharing technology and ideas. Mm-hmm. So why blockchain? I actually came into blockchain by way of healthcare. So digital health is an area that I've specialized in over the last 5 years in particular. And when I came into contact first with blockchain, I heard about Bitcoin, and I thought, well, Bitcoin, I don't know, how's that relevant to anything? And I didn't get the idea. It's not until I understood the differences between Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency versus blockchain as a technology that I started seeing, of course, the parallels and the applications, from times before, but then specifically in healthcare, and that's when I think I got really excited looking at the potential. So we'll be speaking a little bit more about that in terms of blockchain's potential in technology, in healthcare.
Great.
So that's a little about my background.
Great, terrific. So I'm really excited to have you guys here for this conversation today. And I know we got to know each other a couple of years ago in the context of doing an entrepreneurship boot camp and doing some training for entrepreneurs through the State Department. And then we reconnected at a blockchain event here at Stanford, and you guys really did a terrific job in my entrepreneurship class here at Stanford, and in particular, you spoke with the class about the 4 pillars of blockchain. So maybe we should start there. What are the 4 pillars of blockchain, and can you give us an intro to this?
Sure, would be very happy to, Chuck. So, we've been working with entrepreneurs and also with investors and with different audiences for many years. And what we have found is really useful when there are new concepts is to come up with a framework. Mm-hmm. And so this framework of what we call the 4 pillars of disruption it's not necessarily a framework that's out there, but it's something that we've come up with as a kind of an easy way to understand, its disruptive potential. Mm-hmm. So just very quickly, the 4 pillars include an ultra-secure and immutable store of information. That's what we call the first pillar. And a lot of people have heard about the security aspects. The second one is decentralization of transactions. And we're going to spend, a little bit more time with each of these concepts. But decentralization is very powerful. It's a very powerful concept, and I don't really think it gets enough attention. Interestingly, we see that decentralization gets a lot of attention in Asia and in Europe, but not as much attention in the US. It's more the security, but it's what we call the second pillar. Mm-hmm. And then built-in gamification is what we call the third pillar, and it's really a system of incentives, and it's also interestingly more popular in Europe. And we're going to talk about, especially in healthcare, it has pretty wide applicability. So we'll talk about the built-in gamification, and then open source software. Open source software is really a trend that has been very popular in basically enterprise computing, but it's not really a concept that most people think about a lot, but it's what we call the 4th pillar of blockchain disruption. So if we look at each of those, so let's take a look at the first pillar again in a little bit more detail. So it's really this ultra secure and immutable store of information. And immutable here really means unchanging, or it can't be changed. And you can think of it also as unhackable, right? And with all of the hacking that we hear about every day, and probably each of us has been a victim of it, at some point or at multiple points over time. I know I have.
And I know the data from Mary Meeker's kind of annual summary of the internet transactions and data shows that the number of cybersecurity incidents just keeps going up and up.
Definitely.
As there's more and more data out there on the web
exactly.
and e-commerce transactions being done.
Yes. And Facebook has been in the news as well in terms of centralization and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's a big data store, right? And there's all these big data stores out there which are centralized. The really interesting thing about blockchain is that this data store is decentralized. And so this is a very important concept because you actually build a community of what are called nodes, and each of these nodes carry out a process called consensus. They agree on what is in the ledger. And so blockchain, just to be clear, is actually a distributed ledger technology, or DLT. It's a special kind. And because it's made out of blocks.
Should we talk about the various consensus protocols, or is that too far of a level of detail at this stage in the conversation?
Consensus is a really important concept, and when it comes to really understanding, so a lot of people throw around blockchain and say that all blockchains are ultra secure and immutable, and that's not true, right? And a lot of people say, well, distributed ledger and blockchain are the same, and that's not true either. You can actually get storage of information in a DLT that's not made out of blocks. It's just kind of a continuous stream of information. That one we can leave for a future discussion. But let's just talk about blockchain. And so blockchain by its name is a chain of blocks. And so each block has information in it about the preceding blocks. And so once you have this chain, they're all referring back to the previous blocks. And what consensus does is it does a couple things. So something that a kind of consensus that's pretty popular is one for Bitcoin. It's called proof of work. And there's a lot of positive information about it, saying that it's ultra secure, it's immutable, it hasn't been hacked, and there's all these billions of dollars in Bitcoin that are available in the Bitcoin ledger, and it has not been hacked. One thing I'd like to say about this is there have been exchanges and other aspects of the ecosystem.
Yeah, we should talk about this distinction.
Exactly.
Because some people listening might be confused that they've heard these reports about forks or lost Bitcoin or various things. Yeah.
Exactly.
So what do you mean when you say that the ledger itself is secure versus the exchange platform?
Sure. So the ledger is really all the transactions that make up the blockchain. And so what you're doing with the ledger is you're recording all those transactions that have taken place. And today there are thousands of Bitcoin miners. These are all the people all the nodes that basically agree on the transactions, and they verify all the transactions that are in a particular block, and then they carry out a math problem. This is the work that they do.
This is part of the proof of work.
This is part of the proof of work.
And this has to do with hashing?
Exactly. So each of the computers that is a node is carrying out this math problem, and the math problem, the way it's set up, it's brute force, and so whoever has the most hashing power is able to win a contest, and whoever wins the contest gets a reward of, say, Bitcoin or whatever the cryptocurrency is, if it's a proof of work algorithm, and that amount of money can be significant. With Bitcoin, it's 12.5 Bitcoin, and so over the last year, that's varied from say around $100,000 to over $200,000 if you win this contest. So there's a lot of this has to do with this built-in reward capability, but
which will come to in more detail later.
In more detail, but. Basically, these miners are all trying to solve this problem if they have a really strong computer, and the minimum right now is around $10 million to build one of these mining machines. It's not something you go to the store and you put together in your basement.
Right. It's high capital barriers to
very
entry
high
to get
capital,
into mining.
right?
Yeah.
And so the reason that that's done is that if you have thousands of these nodes, and it's very expensive to have a mining computer or a pool of mining computers, it creates a very high barrier to attacks on the ecosystem. The typical kind of attack that you would have on a proof of work consensus network would be what's called a 51% attack, which means that you try to take over 51% of all the computers in the network. And if you calculate that for Bitcoin, that's going to be tens of billions of dollars. Okay.
So this is what makes the blockchain itself and the data that's on it difficult, if not nearly impossible to hack.
So the first thing is just the amount of money you would have to put up in order to hack the network, right? The second thing is that it is so complex to carry out this specific algorithm that there would be no way for you to, say, create an old block, place it into the blockchain and say that block pays me $1 billion, right? and then finish all the other blocks and basically win this contest.
Because the hashing in each block is dependent on all the previous blocks.
Exactly, exactly.
So the points of vulnerability then are not the chain itself, but the interactions with the broader internet and the exchange platforms, I'm guessing.
Exactly. So this specific blockchain ledger, because of the cost to enter, the amazing amounts of computing power that takes place, is basically too difficult to hack itself. But if you have Bitcoin stored in a wallet on an exchange, that's much easier to hack. And so what we've heard is exchanges, which have these centralized databases, they're not decentralized, they're not using blockchain, they're not using DLT in any way, they're just like your standard database that we've had around for, many years.
Right, makes sense. So this is, from what I've kind of heard around Stanford and Silicon Valley, an area where a lot of startups are working on providing better security there.
Yes.
But so I think we sort of double-clicked and dug down in some of the technical details here. On the first point, maybe we should kind of zoom back up a level so that we don't lose the non-technical parts of the audience.
Definitely.
And maybe either talk about a little bit about why the ledger of transactions is disruptive, or continue. Should we continue through?
No, that sounds great.
Yeah.
So again, this consensus was a really important concept, and in terms of why it's so secure. But this is the most secure kind of database, in essence, that we know of today. It's so secure that its original use case is the financial industry and banks, and Bitcoin is basically supposed to be a universal currency, so it has to be more powerful than all of the databases that are used by banks. Obviously, we're not just talking about Bitcoin. That was just the starting point. The amazing thing, and if we talk about decentralization, is that Ethereum, which is another very powerful protocol and platform.
And decentralization being the second pillar.
Yes, and decentralization is the second pillar. Ethereum, they have something called a DApp, or a decentralized app.
Okay.
And
so what's a DApp or a DApp?
A DApp, as they say. So there's a protocol which is known as the ERC20. And that these are all based on. And the ERC20, what it does is it specifies what we now know as a smart contract. And so a smart contract is a trustless contract. Trustless in the sense that you don't need an intermediary. Typically, if we carry out any kind of transaction, we need some trusted player, maybe a bank, or maybe an insurance company, or maybe
a law firm,
or maybe it's
the government,
or something like that, right? We usually need some kind of trusted authority. The beauty of blockchain is the trust is in the network.
Correct.
Okay? And so, because again, the ledger, like this first point, is so secure, we can ensure that all the transactions that are recorded in the ledger are correct, and all the details about them are correct. If that were not the
due
case,
to the consensus protocol providing the trust and the mathematics and cryptography.
Exactly. And one thing is that each transaction in the ledger is cryptographically signed with the private keys of each user, and it's dated, it's time-stamped. So there's this amazing automatic process that all of these transactions are secure, and we have a complete audit trail that just happens automatically. So what this does as a foundation is it allows us now to do peer-to-peer transactions, because the information is transparent. It's going to be put into a public ledger that we can all see. And Ethereum's these smart contracts have basically been adopted by the community to create applications. And a smart contract can really do anything. And so if you think of the blockchain as kind of the underlying internet infrastructure, right? It basically gives you a foundation for communication. In this case, it's giving you kind of a security layer. What you're building on top of that with the smart contract is the ability to build any kind of application. And these applications, because they're peer-to-peer, they take out all the intermediaries. And so from a business standpoint, they can be a lot less expensive than what we're accustomed to. They can be potentially faster. A big application of smart contracts in banking is to take settlement. Like if you sell a stock or if you do any kind of financial trade, it usually takes around 2 to 3 days to settle, because there's all these intermediaries that basically have to reach consensus. They have to all agree with each other.
This is removing those intermediaries.
And you're removing those
supply
all,
chain. Yeah.
so you can basically get consensus in a very short period of time. And settlement can happen in minutes on the Ethereum, basically what's called mainnet, the Ethereum chain.
Yeah. So I think this issue of decentralization and smart contracts is a really important point, because I
Yes.
think a lot of people equate blockchain with Bitcoin and
Yes.
with the currency,
You mentioned
right?
that
Yes.
earlier.
And I think it's when people start to understand this additional fundamental capability of blockchain to
Correct.
enable smart contracts
Yes.
that, at least for me, that's when I started to see all these other possibilities and the broader potential.
It's any business application, right? And this is the web. So Ethereum is basically like the web for, it enables the web, right? Where we can build businesses, we can build interactions, we can basically do any kind of transaction that we have today, but more secure, faster,
Yes.
cheaper, and
Without some of the centralized intermediaries.
without the centralized intermediaries.
Which is what has the banks and the law firms and all of
Exactly.
those traditional
Yes.
trusted intermediaries concerned about.
And I thought I'd add just further to that that the power of blockchain in this respect, from just how business is conducted, is really remarkable, because when you think about why the internet was created and how it's different, the internet was created with openness in mind. It was a very different purpose, and it was really a communication platform. And I think we've all enjoyed that openness and that level of communication, the reach that we've been able to accomplish globally with internet. The purpose of blockchain, however, is very different, because it makes up for all of those big potholes that we have in the internet, namely security and trust. I mean, these are things that are big issues with the internet, but again, recognizing the different purpose of internet, and now blockchain coming in with a very different purpose in mind.
Yeah, and Radhika and I just published an article on identity and trust, and we can potentially leave that for a future podcast.
Yeah.
But that is something that is missing in today's internet, and that's why we have all this hacking and all of these issues.
Yeah, everything that we see in the press these days
correct.
about Facebook and social media and so
Exactly.
on. Yeah, so we'll definitely have to come back to the issue of identity and security. So we talked about the first two pillars of the immutable ledger and decentralization. Should we move on to the third, gamification?
So we've touched also on gamification when we were talking about like proof of work consensus, that there's this reward, and it's actually how the tokens come into existence, right? So that's one kind, is basically the reward token. But you can also have incentive tokens. So an incentive token, we're kind of used to this in like loyalty points. For example, if you do something
for airlines,
right,
travel,
or for travel, or let's say it's you have like maybe a Fitbit or something like that. You'll get like a badge, or you'll get the Apple will give you some kind of a reward of some kind for doing something that it sets as a goal, right, for you. So the really nice thing about dApps is you can use these cryptocurrency tokens that we hear about, with the initial coin offerings that are in the press so much. And that's a whole other area. But basically, an initial coin offering is when you offer your coins for distribution to a community, right?
Which is how a lot of startups in the blockchain area are raising funding these days.
Exactly. And so, you have to get your tokens out to the community, because the big difference between blockchain and the internet is with the internet and the web that we're used to, most things are free or close to free, right? Or maybe they have an upfront payment, maybe once a year or something like this. But we're accustomed to a pretty free internet. In blockchain, and it's going to change the paradigm, you pay for everything. Mm-hmm. And really what you're paying for is you're paying for access to services. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have tokens with you at all time. It's like playing a video game and you want something cool to happen in the video game, you're just going to have to buy gold, you're going to have to buy gems, and you're going to and that allows you to buy other things.
But it sounds like in addition, this offers an opportunity to incentivize certain types of behavior among users.
We'll get to that in healthcare.
Yeah. And so this can be used for behavior modification, and we'll talk about that. So it basically makes the world of blockchain gamified, and it's like a real world video game in that regards.
Yeah, and I think, we were discussing earlier that, one way to think about this is gamification, and that's, top of mind for the gaming community and industry. In academia, we tend to think about this in terms of incentives and economic theory.
Sure.
But definitely a lot of overlap regardless of what the label is that's used for it.
Yes,
We'll
exactly.
cover a little bit. We'll come back to the issue of identity, but I think that, a lot of that has been in the press lately. And I think the power of blockchain when it comes to incentivization or gamification, as you might call it, is really to have each person being able to be arbiters of their own identities and being able to monetize their own identities in specific ways. So we might opt in and say, yes, in order to use certain platforms or services or apps or whatever that's out there, we are offering up information about ourselves. But we're not necessarily being able to monetize our own information. So I think in the blockchain future, this gamification and incentivization is so central to the consciousness of blockchain that I think we'll be able to all be incentivized and being able to monetize aspects of ourselves selectively.
Yeah.
So this is another very powerful
concept.
concept.
We'll get to some examples of that soon.
Yes.
But let's touch on the fourth pillar.
Yeah, and the fourth pillar is that it's a very different concept. Most companies today have closed source software. It's proprietary. You can use the software, but you can't download the source code. You definitely don't have the ability to take the source code and create a new company out of it. But that's, again, a change, right? Is that all ERC-20 projects, so on the Ethereum blockchain, it is an open source protocol, and so anything that you do that's a derivative work is also open source, and everyone that is building projects basically has their project on GitHub, which is a big hub of open source projects, and you can go there and you can look at the source code. Right? You can become a contributor. So in the community, you can just say, oh wow, this is a really cool project. Let me contribute to this project. And you can start writing code, right?
And there's starting to be some academic research on open source as well. And part of the attraction to looking at open source software is exactly the potential that you can have a lot, you can crowdsource innovations, and that bugs or security flaws are easy to see when you have many eyes looking at this.
Yes, and this whole thing in terms of crowdsourcing, so a really important concept is this, again, a decentralization. So these people are everywhere, and so the people working on your software could be anywhere. The people in your community that are using your product can be anywhere, and the people that are helping drive the transactions that power your like the nodes, like power your consensus or power, just how your smart contracts work, that can all be decentralized too. So you have no proprietary code. Patents don't make any sense because this is open source. And the community, and we see this happen, they can say, I really don't like the way the team that's driving this project is doing things. And they can take the code and they can do what's called a fork, and they can create a brand new product. And we see this with Bitcoin Cash, and Bitcoin Diamond, Bitcoin this, and Bitcoin Gold, and there's all these versions of Bitcoin.
Let me just ask the question. We've had open source software long before blockchain came along.
Yeah.
So what's different about it in this context relative to we're now at the point, I think, where, at least according to a recent survey, over half of the businesses worldwide are using some open source software in running their business.
Yes, and that's mostly because of Linux, right? So all the servers are basically running Linux,
right?
And so that has proven the power, especially because it is open source and it has become dominant, and all the major companies in the world with closed source were fighting it, and it bubbled up and it became the best, right? And so but that's one thing, and there's a few other things that are in the enterprise that have become open source, and people do use a lot of open source code in other projects. But what this is, it's saying that all your code, everything that you have, is open source, and it says that there really is no such thing as a company, because your community, which is helping you to build it and is running your transactions and are your customers, can take the code away from the creators and make a new company with it.
Yeah. So this
So
is
it's
a
very different.
really big idea.
It is a big idea.
That startups or companies could be crowdsourced.
Yes,
Yes.
crowdsource the whole
future.
company. And again, this gets into governance and things like that. There are some companies that form themselves so that they can't be forked because they're worried about actually the community taking them over. But it gets into these whole things, this whole concept about what is a company.
Right. Yeah.
And,
lots of interesting strategic issues and lots of things for academics like me that are interested in studying organizations to work out in the years ahead of how all this works.
And also thinking about company structures. I think the concept of these starting out as a startup and then the dream is to become this big world dominant company. Well, what does that really mean? Is it size? Is it number of employees? I mean, what does that constitute? You can certainly become a world dominant or market leader, but not necessarily do it with size and number of employees. It's not suddenly a size of company that matters anymore.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Bitcoin and Ethereum, Bitcoin, nobody even knows who, Satoshi Nakamoto is, and he's disappeared, so there's no CEO. The company, in terms of the developers, are like 10 people, right, that are most active, and you can just go and look at their work, right, and see what they're doing, and they talk about it. Ethereum is really like 3 people, right? There's Vitalik Buterin, and then there's a few other developers, and they do most of the work, but they have this massive community, and there's thousands of companies that have been spawned by the smart contract concept and the ERC20 tokens.
Yeah, well, and this is definitely a trend that we see in terms of platform-based businesses and the productivity gains that are possible through software.
Yeah,
correct.
Where you can have, in the case of Instagram, I think it was just maybe 15 to 20 or so employees, and yet they're creating hundreds of millions of dollars of value and serving millions, if not billions, of customers and postings each day.
Yeah.
So it's really a kind of different way of competing because you're leveraging the community and the network in a platform-based business as opposed to a product-based business.
And I think what all these 4 pillars are basically saying is that this is not a technology. This is a paradigm shift, right? Which has the ability to impact all of us and our online experience. What is a business? What is a company? What are business models? And it actually has some really interesting ramifications in an automated world, right? And we've been talking with people that say that it's a foundation for universal basic income, right? Coming from not governments, but from the private sector. And so there's a lot of different things.
Big
that's
topic there.
Another big topic there.
Well, so I think these 4 pillars of disruption give a really nice overview and framework as a way for people to get an introduction to the kind of lay of the land of and why blockchain has a lot of potential as a set of innovations and technology going forward. But we've been talking at this kind of fairly conceptual, abstract level. Maybe we should dive into a few examples next.
Yeah,
so
most definitely.
Bring some of this to life.
Yeah, sure. I'll just briefly say that, Radhika was talking about healthcare. We have been collaborating on quite a few healthcare projects in the last 5 years. And what we've done in terms of looking at healthcare is that we feel that 3 of these pillars are really they're very relevant. And so the first one, which would be the ultra secure and immutable store of information. The second, really the decentralization of transactions. And the third, which is the built-in gamification. And now I'll hand off to Radhika so she can talk about, some of these key applications in healthcare.
Great, sounds good.
So from a healthcare perspective, and we wrote an article recently about blockchain in healthcare from a data-centric perspective, and when you think about transactions and records on the blockchain, right?
Yeah.
You're talking essentially about records, data,
Right.
and when it comes to the foundation of healthcare, in terms of what you really can do with it, besides, of course, providing optimized care to everybody in the world, it's really about our data. And so let's step sort of at 30,000 foot level and talk about data in healthcare. People have potentially heard about the electronic health record. They might even have heard of the personal health record. Electronic health records have been around, are vibrant parts of the healthcare ecosystem, if you will, as foundations. But there have been some significant challenges. The idea behind having an electronic health record is to provide optimized care to an individual.
Yeah, they've been around a long time, but
They've
it seems
certainly
like
been around a
the
long time.
potential that's there in terms of improving healthcare has not really been fully realized, and it's been a slow adoption curve. Right?
Correct, exactly. And the reason why it's been challenging to implement to fullest potential has been because trust, security, the identity, access, all of these are pressure points.
Yeah, and heightened pressure points in the case of healthcare data.
Correct. And so what ends up happening is that data has been siloed and fragmented with all the different providers. So if you think about a real world example, first of all, there is no such thing as a comprehensive record. It's a piece of you that resides with each provider that you might go and visit over the course of your lifetime. So as a baby, your parents take you to the pediatrician, you get maybe an immunization record. That's one piece of you. Then along the way, you grow up, something happens, you break a leg or a bone, you're doing some sports, now you go visit an orthopedic specialist. Now there's another piece of your record right there. You get sick, you go to a general practitioner, that's another piece of your record. So over the course of your life, how many pieces of you exist?
Geographic moves.
Right, and each of the people that you go to visit as healthcare practitioners have your record. It really doesn't belong to you.
Yeah,
And so
it's fragmented.
And it's fragmented. So the concept of electronic health record is beautiful, but if you've got data that's siloed and fragmented and furthermore interoperable, what do I mean by that is that each of those healthcare records sits potentially in a different kind of system, and the ability for one system to then interact with another system and for that data to be shared freely across systems is also challenging. And then when you think about where are the vulnerabilities in this system, we've all heard about medical systems, healthcare systems being hacked. The hackers are not really after the medical record. What they're after is the sensitive parts of your record, which is your identity. Because typically you'll have your name, your date of birth, a social security number or other identification number. All of these are valuable parts of your identity that are then manipulated in black markets, if you
Yeah.
will.
Well, and a lot
And-
of these have been ransomware attacks at
Correct.
hospitals also, right?
And so that cripples these organizations to be able to provide the care that is most needed by individuals. And so when you think about all of these vulnerabilities in terms of implementing an electronic health record and even a personal health record, which a lot of companies are trying to get their arms around, you really have a very big mess. And so the potential of blockchain to work through the fundamental or systemic issues of data in healthcare systems, which is access, security, trust, and then to be able to construct, probably unprecedented in time, a truly unique patient health record that is comprehensive and historically valid over the course of your life continuum. That's a really exciting frontier that we're looking at.
Yeah, definitely seems like a lot of startup opportunities there.
Oh yeah, and there are a lot of startups that are doing some work in this area, so it's very exciting to see.
Yeah.
If you look at the patient health record or the personal health record, that is really the building block for all of the different opportunities that you see in healthcare. So think of the next opportunity, which I'd like to talk about, which is population health. Historically, population health has been a means for governments or organizations like CDC, for example, Center for Disease Control, to be able to look across major segments of populations, understand what the risks are, what the trends, healthcare trends are across those populations. Those might be across ethnic groups, socioeconomic strata, many different
Clearly,
segments.
this relies on big data sets.
Yeah.
Correct. And another problem with those data sets is that they tend to be biased. So when you
what
look
way?
at, well, when you look at where that data, quality data comes from, it's typically across the usual suspects of segments. So when you think about at-risk populations or underserved segments of the population that might not be able to have their data collected and gathered and stored and analyzed in the way that other segments of the population
Because
are
they don't interact with the healthcare system so
Exactly.
frequently.
Now you're looking at gaps in the data sets. And so even as you're trending across data sets, the vulnerabilities of not being able to access diverse, disparate sets of data across populations and being able to come up with meaningful trends that really represent the whole population, not a percentage of the population, really becomes quite challenging. And so we're now seeing again with blockchain, because you're talking about data sets that are have been verified, are valid across disparate sets of organizations and communities and populations, you can come up with some very great applications within population health. So now when you're studying, let's say, a person in an at-risk community or an underserved community, you can now bring the power of population health, even at an individualized level, down to that person. So let's take an example. You've got maybe a person who is an at-risk person. Maybe they've got a particular type of disease that is not as common, walks into a clinic, needs help. First of all, from the personal health record side, the health practitioner has no idea who this person is. They have no idea what their history is, what they've had before, what they are prone to be potentially at risk for. They have no idea what adverse reactions are going to be.
So they've either got to do without that information or collect it all again.
Well,
from
they
scratch.
typically do without that information.
Yeah,
And
make a
it's
guess.
really the onus is on the person to remember all aspects of their medical history, everything that you're at risk for. How many times have we filled out those forms when we go in to see a doctor? Over and over and over again, right?
Yep.
And so when you think about population health now overlaid with a personal health record, the ability to provide now individualized care optimized to that individual is again very exciting.
Definitely.
Because now you can take, say, a population health study or a trend analysis, and then say that person walks into a clinic in a very different area that they normally reside in, they're traveling, what have you. The new practitioner that they go and see really has a full record of their medical history. They understand what the vulnerabilities are, what their at-risk profiles are, what adverse reactions might exist in their profile, and then be able to recommend something perhaps now, and this is, we're talking about trends, this is where blockchain married with, say, artificial intelligence or IoT or other advanced technologies, now the doctor or the healthcare practitioner can look up or query, based on population health trending data, and then even apply artificial intelligence to this and say, what are the potential recommendations or diagnoses that can be offered to this individual, and go through a differential analysis process, which typically occurs in medicine with very imperfect sets of information,
Right.
and be able to offer a much better diagnosis or treatment to that individual that is then tailored to that individual.
Yeah.
So you really are talking full circle here.
Yeah.
You start with the individualized personal health record, you build up these large data sets, you're able to do analysis using big data or other types of mechanisms to understand trends in these data, and then take all of those insights and now be able to apply it right back down to the individual.
Yeah.
You're really talking full loop here.
Yeah, definitely
which-
really exciting future vision.
Exactly.
And so in this example, I think it might be helpful to kind of draw out
Sure.
how this relates to what we talked about previously and
I
the
was thinking of
concepts.
maybe adding some there.
Yeah, how does gamification and decentralization and
Yeah.
so on play in?
Well, I think one thing is in Radhika's, when she was talking through where the data is it's distributed,
Yes.
right? And centralized systems aren't very good with distributed data, but a distributed system is good with distributed data, and a decentralized system just means that information can be accessed. It's not just out there. So, and you can agree on what it is, right? And
Yep.
and with the blockchain, at each node you actually have a full copy of, for example, each person's information. So you have this potential to get. So that's the first thing.
Yeah,
is
so the decentralization.
Yes.
Decentralization is very important. Second thing is you actually get interoperability. So one of the big challenges that Radhika talked about is how do you get, even if you could get information from one set, maybe one group is just, has one EHR, another has a different EHR, you can create a blockchain version of that data, and that blockchain information is actually it's a lot easier to share across. So interoperability is very important.
Yeah.
So
And
once
the security and
then you have the
immutability
security and the
is
immutability.
clearly important for this kind of personal
Exactly.
health record data.
So I would just say one last thing, which is now you can create these large data sets, right, which are lacking today, and they're secure,
Right.
right, which is something we don't have. And now, because you have, then you can move into gamification. And so maybe you would like to talk about moving into
Well,
gamification.
backing up just half a step, I wanted to stress the fact that through the increased security comes increased trust. Something
Right.
that just
Which helps
doesn't
you
exist right now. The
gather a bigger
reason
data
why,
set.
exactly. I mean, it's kind of a vicious cycle, if you will, because if you don't have good security and you feel you're going to be vulnerable, and what are the points when you're most vulnerable is when you're trying to share or exchange that information. So if that's the hacking point and you say, well, gosh, I don't have enough to protect that, now I'm going to be much more protective of that data and keep it within my firewall, so to speak. And so that then again increases the siloing of that data. So if you have increased security by means of, say, blockchain technology, which guarantees a better sense of security, now it also increases trust.
Right.
So now the ability to share information across systems also becomes much easier. If you look at gamification, so this is kind of moving on, what's exciting in healthcare is that, again, because gamification and incentivization is a fundamental pillar of blockchain, when it gets applied into healthcare, for example, we mentioned Fitbit or another wearable, for example, and behavior is incentivized. It can also be disincentivized. So, if you have feedback about bad behavior, let's say
Vices.
right? People that are trying to quit smoking,
Yeah.
people that are trying to get out of drinking too much, any of those bad behaviors can also be opioids,
yeah.
right? This is a huge epidemic, right? And so this is not to take this lightly. So when you have all of these behaviors that can be either positively amplified or negatively curtailed, if you will, on both sides of the equation, you really have something that can then contributes to the optimal health and wellness of that person. So incentivizing positive behaviors such as exercising better, eating better, maintaining better lifestyles, and then disincentivizing bad behavior, all of this feedback can also be helped with the assistance of blockchain.
Yeah, which is enabled by the tokens and the gamification.
Exactly.
Correct.
And that's the thing, is that you have this baseline because everyone has a PHR, right? So you know what their baseline is.
PHR being the personal
health
record.
record. Exactly. And then think of people being able to get tokens for doing the right thing, or losing tokens, having tokens burned if they don't do the right thing.
Yeah.
And so you're basically being paid or incentivized through these tokens, and you can see it. You can check it every day. And as we know, behavior mod is very effective in healthcare. Many studies have been done, and this approach of incentivizing through rewards, especially if it's done on a continuous or a daily basis, can definitely get people to change their behavior.
Great. So this is a terrific example of one of many potential applications of blockchain in the area of personal health records.
I'll add to this in terms of the incentivization, because there's another application of healthcare that we can briefly touch on, which is the area of virtual clinical trials.
Okay.
So if you think about how the clinical trials are conducted today, which is the pharmaceutical company usually aligns themselves with a healthcare organization that conducts this clinical trial. They have to recruit the right subjects or candidates for this clinical trial, and then they have to have each of those participants go through a four-stage process.
Yeah,
There's
this is
huge
a world that
attrition.
I'm familiar with in a previous life. I was actually at Duke University working in the medical center there.
So you well understand
So we
this.
did a lot of training on
Correct.
researchers and how to use scales in the clinical
Correct.
trials.
Exactly. So I think the future of clinical trials in terms of other opportunities is to take this into a virtual medium where you might recruit these patients or candidates for these clinical trials, but then in previous times, or in the previous world, if you will, or the previous way of doing things,
world.
the pre-blockchain world, there's no real, other than the fact that the candidate or the participant wants to understand or offer up their particular data sets to these clinical trials, maybe because they will then have early access to the drugs that get developed out of those clinical trials, etc. There's no real incentivization which is possible. I think with blockchain, what you have is this gamification, incentivization element where now if you're offering up portions of your data, you can get rewarded for that data. And so there's a better way to engage the participants in clinical trials, and that's a big plus when it comes to clinical trials.
That's a big deal, because this is one of the most costly aspects of the drug development
process. Well, there's a huge
process.
attrition rate. There's about 40% attrition rate in clinical trials currently. And so, again, because the candidates kind of get fatigued through that process, and there's very little to kind of keep them through the entire process that is required. And so you've got costly drug development timelines because they've got to check and recheck these things and sometimes redo things, and so it just takes time, and that time equals money. With the possibility of virtual clinical trials is to again be able to capture participants of clinical trials from very disparate segments of the population that then again can look at the ramifications or implications of drug development across many different segments of the population.
Fill in some of those gaps that might be there.
I mean, this is again there are challenges. So I guess this segues to some of the challenges we're seeing.
This is a perfect segue. So let's talk about some of those challenges, which as we say around here, big problems are big opportunities. But so this may highlight some areas where entrepreneurs and innovators have opportunities for future development. But what are some of the current challenges?
So I can talk about some of the general challenges, and then Radhika will talk about the industry specific, and for example, in healthcare. So a lot of these, we've been talking about Bitcoin, we've been talking about Ethereum. these chains are very focused on security, and they weren't built with like a lot of scalability in mind. And so
because limit in Bitcoin of what, 7 transactions per second.
Yeah, right? Exactly. So you may have 7 to 10 transactions per second. To put that in perspective, Uber by itself does 12 transactions per second, and Uber isn't super scalable. An ad server will do 3 to 4 million transactions per second, right? So you're not going to run an ad server on these types of systems right now.
At least not with proof of work as the consensus
not with
protocol.
Proof of work with the consensus protocol. And there are other consensus protocols because that is the limiting factor, and it's really a trade-off between how much security do you want, right, and how much speed do you want,
right?
And so that's current trade-off. Like in the early internet, you had really slow on-ramps in terms of people getting access, and that changed over time, and we don't really think about being offline right now. But the same thing is that we do have these bottlenecks because of transaction speed, and so those need to be dealt with, and that leads to scalability. So you probably are familiar with CryptoKitties, which was popular last year, and
of
just
course,
that one game.
Yes,
cats in the internet, and this one game basically slowed down the Ethereum consensus protocol because there were just too many people online that were playing this game. It was more than, say, 10 or 15 transactions per second taking place. And so if a single game can bring down your whole network, obviously scalability is an issue.
Right.
And so we have to really find a different consensus protocol. And there are discussions about moving to something called proof of stake, which we can talk about later, but it is something that is significantly faster, and the idea is to get 100 to 1,000 times speed increase in a pretty short period of time. And there are others that can take it even a lot faster than that.
And I know new potential consensus protocols is an active area of innovation. I know here at Stanford there's the Bits and Watts group that focuses on energy markets, and so there's some folks associated with that. They're developing consensus protocols that may work better for energy markets and microgrids.
Yes. Awesome. And there's others, like for example with IoT. So the transactions you have in IoT are going to be maybe similar to what you'd have in energy. They're very short, small amounts of information, but many different devices. For example, 50 billion devices. So you might have industry-specific consensus protocols, but you really need to get to a lot more speed. So those are sort of the general purpose ones.
So coming back to the subject of healthcare, as a sector, obviously there are a lot of challenges within healthcare. As an industry, unfortunately, there are late adopters of technology. It's just the way it is. And so from a regulatory side and also from a behavior side, things can be quite slow to progress. I think there are, I should gasp when I say this, but we're still talking about paper, going from paper to digital, which is still sometimes an issue. I think if you walk into many doctors' offices and want a piece of your medical record or an aspect of your, they'll still photocopy something and send it to you by fax. If you, and I was like, well, who owns a fax machine these days, right?
I know there are others at Stanford that have done studies where they were shocked to find a dry erase board being the key scheduling technology.
Absolutely. So I think, unfortunately, the industry is slow to adopt technology. There's still a lot of legacy systems still very much being used. And the stakeholders in the ecosystems are also wary of sharing because, again, security has always been such a burning issue, and vulnerability to attacks, which are just increasing, and very much a vibrant threat, if you will, today. People trying to wrap their
concerns.
Exactly. I mean, CIOs of hospitals, and these are becoming part of boardroom conversations where they say, how do you deal with these security risks? How do you deal with ransomware attacks, for example? And so when you have all of this concern around security, it just makes everybody in the system wary of sharing what they have.
Right, which slows down the rate of adoption.
Correct.
And disincentivizes entrepreneurs from entering.
Correct. And from a more technical aspect, the file sizes of different medical records can also be an issue. So blockchain as a distributed ledger is just not able to handle large file sizes. So if you take, for example, an MRI image and try to put that on the blockchain, and now you're just not just one MRI image, but multitudes, millions of MRI images, that can really be an issue. So the system itself is not designed for handling large file sizes. We can get into the technical solutions maybe later or at a different in a different conversation. But those are some of the challenges. File storage, then data interoperability, and you might think, well, isn't blockchain also making things more interoperable? Yes, it is. It comes down to also the question of cross-chain interoperability as well. So much like what we have in terms of the interoperability between different healthcare systems, you're going to at some point have to think about cross-chain interoperability in the same vein.
So is that across public chains versus private chains, or private
Yes.
chain to private chain?
Across public and private chains. In fact, I think in healthcare, what Jordan and I see as something that's going to be an important focus in the near term is going to be permissioned chains. That's going to be another subject of conversation again.
Okay, yeah.
But whether
Bookmark that.
Exactly. So the idea behind permission chains is that you have trusted nodes, trusted players, trusted stakeholders that are handling the different aspects of data, right, in the exchange of data. And so when you think about permission chains, you're now dealing with something that's a little bit more easy to put your arms around. And so when you think about healthcare as a system where trust is a huge issue, they might be much more comfortable working with permission chains. So companies like IBM, which is putting out, which is using Hyperledger, for example, or JP Morgan that spun out Quorum, that has their particular way of handling permission chains. These are some of those systems that I think are going to be much more aptly suited for something like healthcare where trust is a central issue.
We call it enterprise blockchain.
Correct.
Enterprise blockchain.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, we're working on another article on this topic, this very subject of enterprise blockchain.
Great. Well, so this has been a fascinating conversation, and you two are both with Double Nova, and so if folks are interested and want to learn more or read more of your writing or connect with you, where can people find you on the web?
Sure. So we publish on Crypto Oracle on Medium.
Okay.
So Crypto Oracle is a group that has been developed by Lou Kerner, who is a very active Israeli and American investor in the crypto space. He got in pretty early. And then also on LinkedIn.
Right. You can
Great.
search under our individual names. We post our articles. We also have our articles on our website, www.doublenovagroup.com. So you can find us there. You can also get in touch with us on other means, WeChat, Twitter, Telegram, kind of out there in social media quite heavily. So,
Great, terrific. Well, thank you both so much, Veronica and Jordan. Really appreciate you talking with me today and sharing with us the 4 pillars of disruption and blockchain. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much,
Thanks
Chuck.
very much,
Really
Chuck.
appreciate it.
Really had a great time.